Thank you, Sarah, for that lovely introduction. And good evening to everyone. I'm really pleased to see you all here, and thanks very much for making the effort to come along. I'm delighted to see my colleagues and students from the school who've become very quickly over the last year hugely valued colleagues and many count as friends. And I'm also pleased to see people from the wider university as well as guests to the university. And I'm very glad too to see some of my lovely family. So tonight my husband's here, and Helen and Ross, Alice and Jason, and my very dear friend Mary. So when I think about ageing and old age and the way that it is constructed, I'm aware of a number of paradoxes. On the one hand, we are besieged by visual imagery associated implicitly or explicitly with messages about successful ageing. Picture the kinds of advertisements that portray successful ageing. Imagine this. A handsome, greying at the temple, 60-something heterosexual man, romantically entwined with his equally handsome wife, who is dressed in something loose and flowing and definitely glamorous, leaning into the railings of the cruise liner, gazing out to sea at the symbolically spectacular sunset, content with their lot, libidos intact, children launched, and living the dream of the happy, well-resourced third age, personifying a narrative of later life as a time of growth and development and reaping the rewards of the life lived. In contrast, barely a day passes without the problems of an ageing society being presented to us. We see headlines about growing numbers of older people, and there's an implicit message of burden about that. The burden of dependent elderly people on the taxpayer, the struggle to adequately fund social care in the context of cuts, winter pressures on the NHS, delayed discharges, costs spiralling out of control, the lengthening of eligible pension age, the need for younger people to work for longer with a retirement age some point in the future, and uncertainty about the future funding of pensions. The burden narrative of old age and what is taken from the public purse to fund old age appears in direct contradiction to the commentary which suggests that older people have it all, that they've amassed resources and achieved a lifestyle that younger people can't hope to achieve. And I think that many people here, if you think about the polarised way in which ageing is presented, will know that it has little to do with most people's experience of ageing and growing old. The dominance of a burden narrative highlights the construction of old age, sometimes referred to as the fourth age, as a time of frailty and of loss of agency, disembodiment, and accompanied by dependency and vulnerability. Gilliard and Higgs have argued that frailty is held within a social imaginary, a black hole or a socially empty space, which is unknown and unknowable. Given the value that we place on ideas of autonomy and individuality and independence, it's perhaps no great surprise to us that we have such a polarised view of old age. I think there's often a deep ambivalence about growing old, reflecting on the one hand our hopes and aspirations for a good old age as a time of continued growth, of development, time to kick back and do the things that we haven't had time to do in the busyness of life, against fears on the other associated with ageing bodies, disembodiment, and physical and mental decline. The majority of you here can expect reasonably to live into your 80s. A significant number of you will live into your 90s. And some of you will even make it to be a centenarian. Yet for many of us, regardless of where we are on the life course, we perceive old age as out there, not us, which some have argued is a form of ageist distancing. I've spent a lot of my life as a social worker with older people and being involved in gerontological scholarship, learning and teaching and research. And so it is to the influence of gerontology, the multidisciplinary study of ageing and old age, that I focus on this evening. Over the course of the next 45 minutes, I plan to reflect on aspects of my own biography and its influence in shaping my career path. I expect, in common with many of us here, that my route to an academic career was neither straightforward or predicted. I will also describe my development through social and critical gerontology scholarship and research. And to do this, I've picked a few examples, one from the very beginning of my career, academic career, one or two from the middle, and one or two from now. The threads that run through these examples have influenced the way that I see the world as an academic and also as an ageing woman. Inevitably, my perspective is shaped by my worldview, by my lived experience, and by my disciplinary orientation. As I reflect on the question that I pose, I make some suggestions as to how research might contribute to future directions in responding to an ageing society. Finally, I pose one or two questions that I hope you might take away with you and think about. Inevitably, I can't hope to give a complete picture in a short space of time, nor do I have the wisdom or the expertise to comment on every aspect of life likely to impinge on our experience of ageing. But hopefully we can continue the discussion after tonight. It's important to say that by the time I was born in the late 1950s, population ageing as a future demographic trend was already formally reported. Papers on the Royal Commission on Population published in 1949 confirmed that changes in birth rates would result in an ageing society in the future, an ageing population into the future. So contrary to media opinion, older people did not suddenly appear to the shock, surprise and horror of the rest of us. I grew up with my younger brother in a predominantly single-parent household. That's me with my mother. Catherine Holden's historical analysis of singleness demonstrates that in post-war Britain and well into the 60s, marriage remained the only form of committed union that was accorded legitimacy, deriving authority from church and state. And this was despite a rising divorce rate and family dislocation. I spent most of my childhood and younger life in the suburbs of Croydon, where my mother was regarded as unusual on two counts. First, in her status as a single woman who was a single parent, and second, as a visibly disabled woman. Reflecting on my early family life, I would say it felt as if we were both marginal, seen and treated as different to most families, and visible because of our difference as a family headed by a physically impaired woman. By the time I went to senior school, the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act had become law and was considered really revolutionary in its potential to transform the rights of disabled people. The Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation was still a couple of years from publishing their terms of reference and beginning work which would ultimately lead to the transformatory social model of disability. But day-to-day recognition of the structural barriers that disabled people experienced was really not on the agenda. On reflection, I can see that my mother's disability was seen most often as a tragic case of individual misfortune, and people tended to see her as a victim. Combined with pity that she had been left alone by her errant husband, she often seemed to be referred to as poor Patsy. At other times, despite the challenges of managing on a limited income and with a physical condition that was variable and unpredictable, her generally sunny disposition and obvious resilience was constructed as heroic, and so she also often became known as the brave poor Patsy. In my experience, these adjectives did not come close to capturing the essence of my mother, but I think largely she was expected to be grateful, or certainly tolerant of people's benignly charitable view of her. While I couldn't claim with any certainty that my early biography shaped my later decision to train to be a social worker, it seems unlikely to be a complete coincidence. I know that I developed through first-hand experience insight into and experience of the impact of discrimination and of exclusion. As a child, it was not uncommon to be excluded from places because we couldn't go there, because my mother couldn't access them. Public accessibility hadn't really begun to be a matter of much concern then. Before the notion of being a young carer had been conceptualised, I, along with countless other children and young people, spent much of my childhood and into adulthood caring for my mother as her condition fluctuated, changed, and ultimately deteriorated. My family commitments, combined with being socially awkward and very shy, resulted in an unremarkable school attendance and poor academic achievement. I left school at the age of 16 with 3 O-levels, perhaps not surprisingly, given my role at home. One of them was cooking. I still do like cooking. No one in my family had ever stayed on at school, even to do their A-levels, let alone think about going to university. The family expectation was that it was time that I went out to earn some money. As some of my school colleagues already know, after a brief and unhappy foray into the world of trainee dental nursing, I resurrected my failed RSA typewriting, dusted down my typewriter, and worked in various clerical posts without displaying any remarkable talents as a future administrator. I go so far as to say I was fairly bad at it. Bored and frustrated, I registered with the Open University in my early 20s. By then, I was pretty desperate to try to expand my world and to inject something a bit more interesting and meaningful into my life. I studied a broad base of social science subjects, which really helped me in terms of applying a more theoretically informed questioning and critical lens to my lived experience and beyond. My school experience had more or less adhered to the precept of banked education, or depositing pre-selected knowledge into the minds of passive learners who sat there and took dictation. But as an adult learner in the OU, my experience of learning was a revelation. It reflected rather more Paulo Freire's notion of consciousness raising, in which learners begin to develop the ability to analyse, to pose questions, to take action on the social, political, cultural and economic contexts that influence and shape our lives. And in this way, education had a transformatory potential for me. And I spent the next 16 years kind of worshipping at its altar. As my confidence as an adult learner grew, I was able to recognise my interest and desire to try to find work with people who were marginalised or oppressed in some way, seen as marginal to society's mainstream concerns. So after 2 years in a toy library for disabled children, where my role bridged administration and direct work with children, I developed the confidence to apply for a job at Grove Park Hospital for people with learning disabilities. Over 20 years have passed since Enoch Powell's so-called water tower speech, and the fusion of political ideology with a moral imperative to empty large-scale institutions of its inhabitants was at last evident. Grove Park Hospital was a former workhouse and a sometime tuberculosis hospital, and became a stopgap home for dozens of people who were moved from the larger Dartmouth Park Hospital. The people who moved to Grove Park came in groups, with little or no preparation, with few possessions, leaving behind a run-down, poorly equipped and crowded institution. Dartmouth had been home for 50% of the population for over 25 years. And by the time they moved to Grove Park, many of them were older men and women. They came to a run-down, poorly equipped hospital, which had barely escaped its workhouse origins. My role was to develop a leisure library and to offer activities to residents who, frankly, lived in socially and environmentally impoverished wards. It was quickly evident that I would achieve little, if anything, on my own. The best way to hope to achieve anything was to collaborate with people who, like me, were motivated to change the culture of practice. Together, we achieved more than we could have hoped to on our own. We shared knowledge and skills, we were braver in numbers, and simply having more people around to do what we tried to do was important. And this included life story work for people who were moving on from Grove Park to other types of housing. It struck me as an affront that traditional practice with people with learning disabilities meant that knowledge or insights about their lives and biographies had been rarely saved and valued. Their lives had been largely lived out of sight. They were stigmatised by virtue of their learning disability and labelled because of their institutional lives, and at its worst, objectified. But it was evident too that people at Grove Park found ways to resist, to exert agency, and wherever they could be, to be themselves. From an unremarkable start at school, I did quite well with the Open University and achieved a BA in psychology and education, and then, as Sarah has already told you, decided to train as a social worker. I don't think I've ever seen that picture as largely represented. It's a bit scary. I trained at an interesting time, but then I guess everyone here who's trained in health and social care, every moment of us that trained is an interesting time. In any event, it was on the cusp of profoundly influential reforms in social work in general, and specifically social care for adults. The high hopes for the reform of social work as laid out in the Seabourn report was causing concern. Despite evidence at the time about social work being at its most promising in terms of effectiveness, confidence in social work was paradoxically at its lowest. A number of child deaths had raised questions about the ability of generic social work teams to manage child protection. Social work with older people was given a lower priority, and combined with a persistent lack of community resources and a perverse incentive in favour of residential care, they were very much seen as the Cinderella service. But the economic and political context was crucially important too, in influencing reform and culminating in the new right achieving a model of social welfare with the aims of reducing public spending, rationalising state provision, and developing market mechanisms. So by 1988, when I began my social work training, generic social work service departments were in the last throes of being reorganised into children and families teams and adult teams and departments, and a new framework for the reform of welfare in the shape of community care was born. My practice specialised in social work with older people, and over the course of my career I worked in a variety of settings, as Sarah has already told you. And I had been taught by Brian Sheldon and Geraldine MacDonald, who were really committed to the importance of evidence informing practice. So it made complete sense to me that I would toddle off to try to develop my knowledge base around ageing research, to try and improve the practice in my team and improve my practice, of course. I didn't initially have a clue what gerontology meant, and when I was recommended to apply for the MA Gerontology programme, I was accepted, and after a year, and having figured out what gerontology meant, I converted to registration as a part-time PhD candidate. So as biographical turning points go, arriving at Keele was very significant. I couldn't have known the extent to which it would shape my future, from being a full-time social work practitioner to ultimately a full-time academic. And from this point forward, gerontology became a continuous thread in my professional life, and for many years intertwined alongside my identity and role as a social worker. I'm going to tell you a bit about my PhD because it's one of the sort of early points and the turning points of my kind of thinking. And it developed out of an abiding interest in social relationships, which I suppose is not uncommon for people who work in this sort of area. And also observations from my practice and insight from the gerontological research base that I'd been reading about. From a practice, I'm very bad at doing this. From a practice perspective, couples' relationships were substantially overlooked, and they tended to only exist when they entered our field of vision. There were significant gaps in contemporary research about long-term marriage, especially from the couple's perspectives and their experience. And so these combined areas brought me to my investigation: the impact of late life, long-term illness and disability on marriage. Crucially too, there was little research on the role that older people played in providing unpaid care. It hadn't been recognised until sort of fairly recently, as I started my PhD. In carer research, despite recognition thanks to the work of Gillian Parker that care took place in the context of a relationship, research very rarely asked people in the relationship about their experience of care. Instead, they tended to ask one person in the relationship about care. So I intended to address some of that gap by carrying out longitudinal biographical interviews with people who'd been married for 35 years or more. My research found that care was, of course, contextualised by relationships which had existed across an adult lifetime and which, by and large, were characterised by care and concern. Traditionally, research on unpaid care tended to present it as a fixed and unchanging role, but my research highlighted that care roles, certainly in the context of older people, that care roles were often dynamic and changeable, and over the period of the study were even interchangeable in response to fluctuating and unpredictable needs of partners. There were too couples for whom there was no identified carer. Rather, a relationship of interdependence existed in which mutual support was shared between the couple. I found that relationship and individual biographies provided important insights into the way that illness and disability were constructed and experienced. Long-established relationship norms and continuities were important to the couples. Why wouldn't they be? And their desire to preserve them highlighted why, for example, formal care offered was sometimes experienced by the participants as unhelpful and was ultimately rejected. Here, Mr. D reflects on the challenge of formal care not meeting his wife and indeed his own needs. So he says, well, my wife is wet every morning, and this was a great trial to her and me. I couldn't see her sitting in a wet bed in clothing, so I got her up and gave her a good wash and brush up. The home care girls had nothing to do when they came in, as it had all been done. My analysis of the narrative accounts of older people, including those who are functionally frail, showed how they sought to manage change and uncertainty and maintain important continuities as a means of preserving individual and relationship identities. Here, Mrs. S reflects on her husband's cognitive impairment and links this with occupational threads and also reflects on their marriage. She says he needs stimulating and people talking to him. One of the things I found he enjoys is paper and letters, a notepad and pens. He sits all day back in his office, sorting things out, and his mind's ticking over. He's moving, his hands are moving all day long, his brain is moving. He's aware of me as his wife. As soon as he comes home, there's a hug and a kiss. So from that point of view, you can't say the marriage is dead. There's affection there, because he'll kiss quite well in bed, and you know, his arms come round when I get into bed. When I completed my PhD, I returned to practice, but studying had become part of my life for 14 years, mostly part-time, and I had focused on trying to make good my early school failings. With support from my supervisor, Mim, as Sarah told you, I was successful in being awarded an ESRC fellowship. During this time, among a host of other activities, I carried on exploring social relationships via secondary analysis and ultimately secured a lecturing post at Keele. Subsequently, I worked for many years as a social work academic, immersed for the greatest part of my time in social work education, module leadership, program leadership, learning and teaching, placements, teaching partnerships, fitness to practice, validation, and all that goes with vocational training and education. I was keen to develop collaborative work with older people and practitioners. Part of my brief was to develop continuous professional development for an interprofessional workforce and to widen partnerships in the community. So, as an example, in partnership with the Stoke Care Home, I set out to support care staff to reflect on aspects of their own biographies and the influence of life events on their identities. An action learning project followed, developed with and by the care staff, to promote the use of biographical approaches in person-centred care for people living with dementia in the care homes. Staff identified a number of ways in which their practice through this experiential process had changed, including an increased opportunity for activities as part of daily life, as opposed to activity sessions. Care plans which were much more about individuals rather than cut and paste statements which were applied across the care home population. And based on a series of pre- and post-dementia care mapping observations, improvements in residents' well-being. Here, the registered manager reflects on it being a sort of a bit of a light bulb moment in that it helps them to have insight into the lives of people with dementia and how they communicated with us how they showed their meaning and their context, their constructions to us. The behaviours of some of the residents suddenly made sense, and we were able to respond to them in ways that were comforting and reassuring. Another brief example which developed my skills in collaborative work with older citizens relates to the development of an ageing studies certificate. This was initially a certificate for older people, developed with older people as part of Manchester's age-friendly strategy. So here we are. Starting with 15 older citizens in a church hall in Chawton, the initiative grew with the support of the Valuing Older People team and the Board of Older People representing Valuing Older People into an accredited interdisciplinary programme, which was delivered to over 400 people working in health, social care, the independent and voluntary sectors. Later, we won further funding from the Department of Work and Pensions, and the course was extended to York, to the Wirral, to Stoke-on-Trent, with further presentations in Manchester. An independent evaluation of the programme found impact in supporting the development of new relationships and evidence of new collaborations and service developments. I'm committed to the development of an informed, integrated practice with the goal of improving the experience of care and services for older people who need it and their families. But social work has had a tenuous foothold in gerontological practice, and I have been keen to do what I can to support its development as a key component in interprofessional practice. To this end, I'm a founder member of the special interest group. We laughingly call ourselves G8. It's Gero 8 actually, but it amused us at the time. So I'm a founder member of this group who shared the disquiet about the marginalisation of older people with high support needs in contemporary practice, and who were interested in its contribution to social and healthcare practice. We've achieved, I'm happy to say, some presence in the area of this area of practice, having focused both on the role of gerontological social work as well as its contribution to the interprofessional arena, and I think that's really important. So, for example, we've had a number of journal articles, we've developed further in conferences via a national report jointly badged with the then College of Social Work, and a number of evidence reviews for practitioners. Subsequently, our report has led to the development of professional capabilities for gerontological practice led by the British Association of Social Work. Most recently, commissioned by the Chief Social Worker for Adults and the Department of Health, we've developed an interactive case study which is an evidence-based examination of practicing complexity with older people. This work was developed in close collaboration with older people who use services, older citizens and practitioners who took part in each stage of the project. And our goal now is to see if we can link this as an exemplar for CPD in the new capabilities framework. As a homegrown academic at Keele, I was fortunate to be promoted and was given a personal chair in 2013. And this was on the basis of 4 routes. I had to demonstrate excellence in learning and teaching, research, scholarship and enterprise, and leadership and administration. And although I had managed over the years of being immersed in social work education to do some research and to be research active, it was really hard to do as much as I wanted alongside achieving, the other stuff that was needed. So I signalled my desire to focus attention for what remains of my career on research and scholarship, although of course, nod to the left, that the other elements are absolutely crucial and fundamentally important to me. My interest in social relationships in older age had persisted and led to my contributing to a book on family practices in old age. And my interest in this was further piqued by meeting Mary Pat Sullivan and over a coffee at Euston Station, reflecting on the place of older people who didn't have children. So with a research grant from the Avril Osborne Fund, we worked with 2 people, Sheila Haywood and Tony Bunce, who were retired people who took on co-research roles, to explore the experiences of and the potential implications for men and women who were ageing without children. Despite at least a theoretical recognition that relationships in older age are characterised by diversity, the availability of adult children to provide care to parents in old age is a persistent policy assumption. Populations have always included people who are not parents, myself included. For many years, people ageing without children had been viewed as a homogenous, childless group who were underbenefited, vulnerable, and socially deviant. I remember trying to write a chapter in the family practices book that I've just mentioned. I was at a low ebb in my life. My own long-term marriage project had failed, and as an ageing childless woman, I appeared to represent the epitome of the research literature's notion of the older, single, childless, isolated, socially deviant woman. I'm happy to say that there is now a more nuanced account of ageing without children, which has gone some way to assuaging some of those early research assumptions. Yet, the voice of older people who do not have children, as well as the voice of older people who express their diversity in myriad ways, by and large, goes unnoticed. Countries with the dominant pronatalist assumption expect parenthood as a fundamental adult duty. And if you fail to achieve this goal, this can have very serious personal consequences and implications. But these assumptions also play out in countries which espouse the value of diversity in old age and across the life course. Research, including our own, demonstrated how people without children are often perceived as somehow lacking, perhaps less mature, probably more selfish, didn't like children, and not as well developed as people who are parents. A very visible example relates to Julia Gillard, who was Australia's first woman Prime Minister. She was pilloried for being childless and publicly accused of being deliberately barren. A journalist pondered how Gillard could understand voters' lives when, quote, she has never had to make room for the frustrating and magnificent responsibilities of caring for little babies. Our research interviewed men and women who had never been a parent, and many of the participants were pleased to take part in research investigating a social status that they occupied and which they often experienced as marginal in a world dominated by parenthood and later on grandparenthood. Here this person says, when I first read the description of your project, I thought that's really interesting because, it always really irritates me the way women, in the media, in newspapers, women, whenever there is a mention, say, by politicians of women, it's always women and children. And it's like, well, no, we don't. We're not all attached to children, There are some of us who are independent. Taking a life course and biographical perspective, the research found that there were very diverse pathways that led people to not becoming parents. And it really challenges that either-or tendency that we have. This perspective, childless parent, or involuntarily childless. The kinds of contexts which shaped participant experience included economic circumstance, sexuality, prevailing social norms, illness, lack of opportunity, unpaid care, the marriage bar, rudimentary and frightening treatments for infertility, late partnering, remaining unpartnered, decisions about sustainable futures, and ethical decision-making. This highlighted the importance of intersections between gender, sexual identity, social class, ethnicity, disability, and cultural membership. Here, a lesbian woman reflects on the secrecy attached to same-sex relationships in her early adulthood and its implications for being a parent. It's difficult to recreate the atmosphere of secrecy and fear and hiding that we lived in those days. It wasn't that we thought about being in the closet, it was that we just knew it in the air that we breathed. We just knew we didn't tell anybody and it was a secret. And so we knew in the same way that if we stayed in that life, we wouldn't have children. I can remember when I was young, just once or twice, I can remember once or twice feeling that I wanted to experience that experience. She says, I didn't really particularly want the children, actually. I just remember very clearly that what it was wanting to have the experience that other women had had. In the main, we found that participants were successful in developing diverse, dense, and effective support networks, including the importance of friends as family. Most of the retired participants made contributions to volunteering and citizenship roles after they retired. While they expressed some disquiet about how they would manage if their support needs included the need for personal and intimate care, participants persistently pointed to the limitations of an assumption that older people with children are always benefited by the care of their adult children, and that it would necessarily follow that it was the best kind of care. The dominance of parenthood created challenges for participants who, despite living positive, valued and successful lives, but did not foreground childlessness, reflected on feeling invisible, subordinate to parents, and vulnerable to assumptions being made about being childless. And here this one reflects very powerfully. We are the invisible people, really. At dissemination events and discussions attended by research participants and others, they concluded that it was timely to challenge policy perceptions that older people without children are uniquely disadvantaged and vulnerable, and that they create additional burdens on health and social care systems. As Claire Wenger has pointed out, those people have never made demands on child healthcare systems, or public education systems, or child benefit, and by and large they've worked for the whole of their lives. Subsequently, I've had the pleasure and privilege of supervising doctoral candidates on a number of funded PhDs which have really developed and extended this area of investigation. Dr. Robin Hadley's examination of the impact of involuntary childlessness on older men, Dr. Karen Jutler's examination of the impact of migration experiences on Sikh children caring for parents with dementia, Shona Willick's examination of the impact of ageing without children for Caribbean women, and Helen Ogden's exploration of the role of siblings in later life. I turn now to a current research project funded by the Wellcome Trust, which combines my interests and those of my research colleagues in relational and collaborative work in contemporary social care policy and practice and its interface with healthcare and the wider care sector. We will examine the experiences and ethical implications for older people who self-fund their care. Led by Lizzie Ward with Phil Locke at the University of Brighton, Denise Tanner and Klinos Jehu at the University of Birmingham, and here at Lincoln with Claire Markham. The term self-funders covers a wide spectrum of people in different circumstances, but include those people who have not met the current eligibility criteria for services, or they subsequently become ineligible, are above the financial threshold for support, they don't approach social services at all and just go it themselves, they top up their local authority funding, for example in a care home, or they purchase additional or supplementary services to provide to support those that are provided by social services. The majority of people who self-fund their care are older people. Cuts to public care provision, pressure on hospital services, stringent eligibility criteria, and the effects of austerity have been factors which have contributed to the rise in the numbers of people who pay for their own care. Estimates from the Commission on Funding for Care and Support suggest that 45% of residential placements, 48% of nursing placements, and 25% of home care services are paid for entirely by older people themselves. Henwood and Hudson have described people who fund their own care as lost to the system and likely to include some of the most disadvantaged and isolated people in the whole system. The funding landscape and navigating care is complex and unwieldy, as our co-research team will testify, and it doesn't necessarily follow that if you've got a few shillings or a few pounds in the bank to pay for your own care, you will necessarily find it easier to access care or will have a substantially higher level of choice. Again, older people's voices are largely absent from the limited literature on self-funded care, and they've played little part in service development or planning. This lack of visibility, I would argue, can lead to serious consequences. For example, the serious case review regarding the death of Mrs. Gloria Foster concluded that inappropriate assumptions had been made about Mrs. Foster's ability to purchase new social care, self-funded social care, when her own care arrangements, which had been long-standing, were suddenly ceased when the border agency closed the home care service that she used. We'll investigate a number of unanswered questions, including what works well and examples of good areas of self-funding, and that's a really important thing to say. Our approach to the research is based on the principles of co-production, which means that knowledge is rooted in older people's experience, and that's privileged. It is then generated through a research process involving older co-researchers at all stages, and then brought into dialogue with key stakeholders such as commissioners, service providers, practitioners, through knowledge exchange. Our distinctive ethical perspective is built on the significance of care for us all, and the understanding that as humans we're interdependent and relational beings. In this way, care is integral to supporting well-being and health, and is understood as a moral practice, requiring a focus on both those who provide and those who receive care, and the care that exists mutually or reciprocally. Our research is organised in that kind of way, and I'll talk around that. Since the start of the project, we've recruited a co-research team, community partner, planned fieldwork, applied for ethical approval, and mapped our research sites to evaluate the ease with which people might access information about care and making purchasing decisions, the kinds of services available in their location. As I've said, the project is underpinned by a knowledge exchange process to promote a dialogue about the emerging research findings between co-researchers, citizens and stakeholders. The new year will see the start of fieldwork extended over 3 timeframes with older people, as well as care providers, unpaid carers and other key stakeholders. And here is the Lincolnshire co-research team, many of whom I'm really thrilled are here tonight. They bring a rich variety of experience and expertise from their professional and personal lives, and have already made a very significant contribution to the development of the project. In this lecture so far, I've introduced the boon or burden topic and said something about my own biography and the strands that represent important themes, continuities and turning points. I want now to return to the title of my lecture. I started this lecture by making reference to the often polarised messages that construct and represent ageing. The ageing as burden message, conveyed with headlines such as this one from the Telegraph, Ancient Britain, has fuelled concerns about how the country will cope in the future and that it will bankrupt health and social care services. This has been referred to as apocalyptic demography. That is, living longer is seen as a problem with negative effects on society and is somehow the fault of older people. Consider the effects that these kinds of messages might have, however subtly, on our perceptions of and attitudes about ageing. They can reinforce the notion of older people as a homogeneous group, the elderly, which denudes or makes less visible the extraordinary diversity that characterises old age. They can scapegoat the older population, and this may be especially prevalent in times of economic constraint or austerity. They can identify older people through a single biomedical lens or as a special category of need and create the potential for intergenerational tension. I think a key problem here is the uncritical presentation of data about ageing, which first has the potential to fuel the demographic time bomb thesis, and second, presents data in a facts speak for themselves kind of way. These messages can imply that just about everyone above a certain age is queuing at the door of the GP, breaking down the doors of the local hospital, care home, nursing home, and you know as well as I do that that simply isn't true. As ever, it's a more complicated picture. For example, the Office of National Statistics Census report on citizens in old age found that for every 100 people aged 85 and over, that 27 people reported their health as being excellent, very good or good, 47 people reported their health as fair, and 26 bad or very bad. 80% of women and 90% of men aged 85 and over were living in private households. Clearly, the health of the oldest old is poorer than that of younger, older people as a statistical norm, and we cannot ignore this. But even those simple figures reveal diversity in the fitness of people aged 85 and over. The implications of health inequalities are arguably a far more important question and relate not just to old age, but to the whole life course. Zaninotto and his colleagues, based on an analysis of the 7th wave of the English longitudinal study on ageing, concluded this, that the health expectancy differential between the top and the bottom wealth brackets in the estimated additional years expected to live in good health at the age of 50 was around 12 years. 8 years for disability-free life expectancy and 10 years for illness-free life expectancy. We know that the cumulative experience of inequalities in social capital, environment and housing, economic circumstances and employment contribute to health inequalities in older age. And yet many of the health inequalities that people experience could be changed through preventative interventions. And for those of you who are thinking, yeah, but I'm not so interested in ageing, I'm much more concerned about children, consider the experience of adverse childhood events and the increase in terms of the chance of premature mortality in later life, as well as a range of illnesses. We are all probably familiar with the stereotypes associated with old age. Messages, for example, about grumpiness, irritability, misery, they're commonplace. Yet successive research have repeatedly and reliably demonstrated that older people possess persistently higher levels of positive affect than people in midlife and younger. This is sometimes known as the ageing paradox, or the older we get, the better we feel. Researchers such as psychologist Laura Carstensen conclude that older people do well, and indeed better, than the rest of the life course at managing mixed emotions, for example, acknowledging sadness and being able to feel sad alongside holding a more positive view of what's good or better, or handling something effectively that's not going well alongside things that are going okay. Older people in general express greater satisfaction with and enjoyment in their lives. Older people, in short, are more likely to experience higher levels of satisfaction in and with life than their younger counterpoints. More broadly, the value that older people contribute and bring to society remains underreported. I hope that you can see from my lecture tonight the extent to which I've personally benefited from collaborative research and practice development with older citizens, both professionally and indeed personally in terms of my own thoughts about ageing. And lest you think that older people are simply the recipients of care, in the last census, the population of people aged 85 and over was recorded at 1.25 million. Of that total, 93,000 people said, aged 85 and over, that they provided unpaid care to a family member, and 50% of those people provided 7 hours co-resident care a day. This is hard work by anybody's standards. In 2016, the Grandparent Tracker Survey indicated that 65% of grandparents who took part provided care to grandchildren, offering on an average 11 hours of care a week, as well as providing financial support and a range of other goods and services. The International Longevity Centre conclude that grandparents have become, next to parents, the single biggest source of childcare, helping parents to work, reducing the cost of childcare, and asking the question about how we support and reward this unpaid army, so-called, and reconcile the increasing need for people to work, as well as expanding family-friendly policies for all. And this remains a subject for debate. But don't elderly people take all of the resources? Well, based on economic modelling by Robert McNabb and Tom Kirkwood, the WVS report Gold Age Pensioners placed a value on the economic and social contribution that older people make to our society. Calculated at 40 billion amongst people aged 65 and over in 2010 through contributions, taxes, spending power, care provision and the value of volunteering. And here Berry comments. In spite of future costs around providing pensions, welfare and health services to a larger and longer living population of older people, the over 65's net economic contribution is predicted at 77 billion by 2030. This is certainly food for thought for those who see this age group as a burden. You can see where I'm going here, can't you? Of course, as we grow into advanced old age, we are more likely to need health and support services. But it is not older people's fault that health and social care services are under increasing pressure. Jill Manthorpe argues that there is substantial evidence that population ageing does not cause unsustainable inflation of health and social care budgets, although it does contribute to rising demand. Healthcare costs are inflated by improvements in health technology, associated costs, and of course people across the whole life course who use health services. As I've already shown, significant numbers of older people pay for their personal and social care. And there's been a reduction in state support for social care by at least 31% between 2005 and 2012. Nor is it the fault that older people, that services sometimes struggle to be responsive to the needs of people who are frail, and as Diana Athill puts it, somewhere near the end. Imagine being in your 90s, beginning to be functionally frail with dual sensory impairments, having had an infection-related delirium, being admitted to hospital following a fall, and being moved ward or bed space several times in 36 hours, culminating in being taken to a discharge ward and left there for 5 hours with other increasingly agitated and worried people, while you wait for goodness knows what to happen next. Care has yet to develop in a systematic and sustainable way that is responsive to the needs of older people, especially those who are frail and who are in the last part of their lives. The development here in Lincolnshire of interprofessional neighbourhood teams offers the real possibility of developing services for older people with high support needs close to home, an important development, and especially in avoiding unnecessary and frightening admissions to hospitals and receiving the joined-up interprofessional care advice and support that those people and their families who are worried and afraid might need. I realise, as well as many of you, that hospital is not a great place for older people, and if they don't need to be there, then of course they shouldn't be. The pace of hospital life is ill-suited to the pace of care, it seems to me, that a person in advanced old age who is frail and unwell may most appreciate. But as David Oliver, the eminent geriatrician, has commented, we can't abdicate responsibility for making them as good a place as we can, because sometimes older people just have to be in hospital. They need it. Liz Lloyd, in her work with frail older people, has commented that there are logical limits to our policy imperatives on independence and autonomy. Those people living with complex needs and towards the end of life, although exercising personal agency remains crucial, getting care that promotes comfort and security and is delivered by people who want to work with older people and who are appropriately trained and supported to do the best they can is a priority. This, of course, has profound implications that we have to grapple with for the health and social care workforce, for workforce planning, and indeed for the status of older people who commit to work in this area. There is clearly a need for more work in this area, including exploration of the subjective experiences of people in advanced old age, about which we know very little. The ways in which we communicate often difficult choices and decisions to those people and to their worried and anxious families and friends, and how we support people on those trajectories. When we make hard decisions and choices, it's okay for us to prevaricate, be illogical, change our minds, and change them back again. So why might we expect older people to behave differently and to somehow be linear and logical in their decisions, or failing that, potentially excluded from them? In conclusion, I've argued that the burden narrative is inappropriate as well as being inaccurate. It is not helpful to any of us, least of all older citizens. It is worthwhile considering the immense value and importance of older people's contributions, everyday, ordinary doing of life, to the economy, the cultural and social life, to citizenship and family and social relationships and networks, and to consider the creative and innovative ways that older citizens do and will continue to contribute to society. I have tried to suggest that apocalyptic demography can fuel moral panics about an ageing society and obscure both the more critical stance on the challenges and opportunities of population ageing and aspects of population ageing such as health and socioeconomic inequalities. In a recent research project with Min Barnard and Jackie Reynolds from Keele, we asked leading gerontologists such as Alan Walker and Robin Means, among other things, what their priorities were for research and policy development. They highlighted their concerns about the continued impact of unequal ageing and the growing gap of ageing experience, fueled by the expectation of an extended working life for people who, for example, do very hard work or who are poorly paid or who become ill, and suggests the risk of growing inequalities into the future. I said about 40 minutes ago that most of us here would reach our own old age, and a good number of you will become very old. What we do now, the life chances we possess, the choices we make, will undoubtedly influence our passage into old age and could influence, for example, the quality of your older age, the number of years you live disability-free, for example. And let's say you do live to advanced old age. It's not unreasonable to expect to feel that we are not a burden when we've given much to society. Nor is it unreasonable to ask what kind of care we might hope for, and what, if anything, we as citizens, as researchers, as practitioners, as policymakers, might do to contribute to the discussion about the opportunities and challenges of an ageing society. Thank you.